Here we are at the former White Plains Armory. Something extraordinary happened here in July of 1776. Back then, things looked a little bit different. There was a lot less concrete, and the building here was not an armory. It was a courthouse. And in the heart of the American Revolution, the birth of the great state of New York was at hand. My name is Austin Olney. I work here at the library, and I've always lived in New York State. But I was born and raised way upstate, far from White Plains, in a little place between Albany and Syracuse called Westernville. I didn't come to White Plains until 2013, but when I did, I instantly became fascinated with its unique story and significant place in American history. Let's talk about it. We'll go way back to the very early days, when White Plains was basically a misty-covered swampland. Indigenous Wappinger natives referred to the land as Quoropas, meaning white marshes. Once the Dutch began arriving in the 1600s, European settlers began to settle, and a village emerged, initially settled by men from Rye, and it was a pleasant, quiet community. Things changed for White Plains in the 1750s, however, with the relocation of the Westchester County Courthouse to the village, where it would become a central gathering place for political assemblies and passionate debates, and, spoiler alert, eventually an armory. The village itself quickly went from essentially a small community to gaining a prominent position in colonial affairs. At the time of this change, of course, it was part of the British colony of New York, one of 13 such colonies along the Atlantic coast. Each had its own government, economy, and pretty much society. By the 1760s, however, they were increasingly becoming united by their dissatisfaction with British taxation and what they saw as interference in their affairs. Westchester County would soon find itself at a crossroads, torn between loyalty to the crown and the growing clamor for independence. In the end, pretty much everyone was forced to choose a side. On the one hand, you have rebel patriots who supported American independence from Britain, and on the other, you have loyalists who wished to remain loyal to the British crown. With such a divided populace, Westchester's initial stance was one of neutrality. In the mid-1770s, as the American Revolution was warming up, open conflict began when American colonists in Massachusetts fought with soldiers at Lexington and Concord. When news of this hit Westchester, tension between patriots and loyalists escalated, and the county was further divided along political lines. The 1775 battles in Massachusetts spurred the summoning of a provincial congress in New York City, charged with directing measures for common safety. This call hinted at the looming specter of war. Westchester County responded quickly, holding a meeting in White Plains led by James Van Cortlandt. This meeting resulted in the election of delegates to represent the county in the New York City Congress, pushing back on British control. And as the wheels in New York turned towards revolution, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia set forth plans for armed resistance, appointing George Washington as commander-in-chief and laying the groundwork for military and financial operations. New York was urged to fortify strategic positions like Kingsbridge, and this would lead to the construction of many redoubts and fortifications, with Westchester County playing a crucial role in safeguarding vital routes and waterways. Westchester would also undertake a comprehensive restructuring of its militia and the establishment of committees to detect loyalist conspiracies. In this charged atmosphere, Captain Isaac Sears led a daring expedition in Westchester, apprehending prominent loyalists and stirring public sentiment. His actions illustrate the escalating conflict between patriots and loyalists and foreshadow the future chaos that would emerge in the county. Meanwhile, the British Army up in Massachusetts was forced out. In the aftermath of this retreat, the British Parliament allocated significant funds for a force of skilled soldiers and also hiring a conscripted force from modern-day Germany, collectively known as Hessians. Their strategy was to concentrate these forces on New York, ultimately hoping to seize the Hudson River and isolate rebellious New England from the other colonies. So the strategic significance of Westchester was undeniable, and everyone was holding their breath, awaiting the British invasion of New York. People started talking about colonial independence, and it was a hot topic of debate. Opinions were sharply divided. The Radical Sons of Liberty and the Mechanics' Union were staunch patriots, finding common cause with revolutionary literature like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And these groups, along with other influential leaders like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris, Alexander McDougall, and more, would rally significant support within the colony. At the same time, there was also a substantial loyalist faction composed of many influential and powerful individuals. In the end, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia would settle the debate and move to a historic decision, ultimately adopting a quote-unquote Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. It was a historic moment not only in American history, but human history. It marked the American colony's formal separation from Great Britain and declared that everyone has basic rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It also articulated the idea of self-government, a fresh concept born from the Enlightenment. In time, it would inspire other countries to pursue democracy. And so with all that in mind, it was kind of a big vote back in Philadelphia. New York's delegates in the Congress did not participate in the vote, however. They abstained, and the reason given was a lack of authority. They had not yet received instructions from New York's provincial government. So the 4 New York delegates in Philadelphia would not initially commit to independence, but they didn't oppose it either. Over in New York, the now official war for independence was heating up. British warships began arriving in New York Harbor, and the provincial New York Congress fled the city and went up to White Plains to reconvene in a modest courthouse. When this happened, it was a big day in White Plains local history. July 9th, 1776. The relocated Congress began with the election of General Nathaniel Woodhull as president, and among the first orders of business was the reading of a letter from New York's delegates in Philadelphia, which included a fresh new document, the Declaration of Independence. A committee led by the renowned John Jay swiftly recommended its approval, and it was unanimously approved. They not only endorsed independence in White Plains, but also transformed the very nature of the governing body. For the first time, it was referred to as the Convention of the Representatives of the State of New York. The subtle change in title had immense meaning. It was the official birth of a new state. The Congress quickly moved to implement these recommendations and mandated the public reading of the Declaration at the courthouse, as well as the printing and distribution of copies across the state. 2 days later, on July 11th, a crowd gathered on a warm, sunny morning. They were on a street at the time known as the White Plains Street, but today we call it Broadway. The courthouse steps were filled with New York's newly christened state representatives, as Judge John Thomas of Rye read the Declaration. It was a public affirmation of New York's commitment to the cause of independence, and it signaled the transition from a colonial governance to a united stand with the other colonies that were now collectively known as the United States of America. Soon after, the 4 delegates representing New York would affix their signatures to the document. These 4 put everything on the line, and no one's ever heard of them. So let's fix that. First up, we have Philip Livingston, born in 1716 in Albany, and graduated Yale in 1737. Despite his initial reservations about revolution, he transitioned from a moderate critic of British policies to a dedicated supporter of independence. Next, we have Lewis Morris, who was born into wealth in 1726 in New York City, and he of course chose to stand with the colonies, a decision that flew in the face of his affluent peers and family, both of whom tended to side with the crown. Another signer was Francis Lewis, born in Wales in 1713. He overcame orphanhood and became a pioneering New York City merchant and explorer. His retirement would beckon in 1765, and this coincided with England's imposition of the Stamp Act, which ignited Lewis's fervent opposition to British rule and pushed him into action. Finally, we have William Floyd, my good old great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. He was born in 1734 on Long Island, and after taking on significant responsibilities after the deaths of his parents, he became active in politics, ultimately serving in the Continental Congress and leading a local militia. These four would sign the Declaration in August of 1776, right around the time the British were commencing their long-awaited attack on New York. The red-coated monster was released on the American countryside. The Continental Army under George Washington suffered a major defeat at the initial battle on Long Island, and they would ultimately retreat and abandon Manhattan Island. By the fall, Washington was taking his remaining forces along the west bank of the Bronx River up to White Plains, where they would make a stand and ultimately halt the red-coated monster. Following the epic Battle of White Plains, up until pretty much the end of the war in 1783, Westchester was caught in between British and American forces, becoming a no-man's land and effectively witnessing a civil war. It was one of the longest-running battlefields of the entire Revolution, earning the moniker Neutral Ground. But it's a story I'm going to save for another day. Today, we're talking about independence. And as for the four New York signers of the Declaration, their fates were varied. Philip Livingston would pass away in 1778, and so he never got to see America's triumph. Lewis Morris faced personal tragedy when British forces seized his home and his wife passed away. Despite these hardships, he remained dedicated to the cause of American independence and would play a crucial role in New York's adoption of the Constitution before his death in 1798. Francis Lewis would retire from politics in 1781 and would spend his remaining years with his sons until his death in 1802. William Floyd faced significant hardships during the war, and especially when British forces occupied Long Island, forcing he and his family to flee to Connecticut. He remained dedicated to the revolutionary cause, holding various governmental positions and rising to the rank of Major General in the New York militia. After the war, he continued his public service, representing New York in the state Senate and participating in the Constitutional Convention of 1801. In 1803, at nearly 70 years of age, William Floyd started a new chapter in his life. He moved way upstate, to a little place between Albany and Syracuse called Westernville. He would live there until his death in 1821, and uncoincidentally, his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, yours truly, would be raised there 165 years later, and eventually find himself in White Plains with you here today. See how it all comes full circle? And that brings us back to the White Plains Armory, which is located on the site of the courthouse where the Declaration of Independence was read on July 11, 1776. In 1910, the building we know today was built to serve as a National Guard armory, and it was vacated in 1977 and converted into Armory Plaza, which is a senior housing complex. There's a monument in front of the building, but it seems like many pass by not even knowing that it was the birthplace of New York, and in some ways, the birth of a new nation, unanimously united in the pursuit of freedom and democracy. something to think about on the 4th of July. Have a good one.